You and I have been doing our hands-on lab work together in a forest, and that forest has had a single domain. Let's review what a large enterprise might design when it comes to Active Directory, and let's jump into a hands-on lab and create a multi-domain forest. So remember, when we create our nuggetlab.com domain, we are operating in a forest called NuggetLab. Now, the forest shares characteristics between the domains, doesn't it? For instance, in this nugget, you and I will create eastnuggetlab.com. Notice this is a child domain off of our parent domain of nuggetlab.com. And all of these domains we could create in here are going to share characteristics, like a big one would be the schema of Active Directory. This, by the way, is called a domain tree. So nuggetlab.com is the parent, and then we create these children, and we're forming what's called a domain tree. You could go into this NuggetLab forest, and you could create another domain tree. So you could start with a new naming scheme and create another tree within this forest. Keep in mind something else you could do. If you had like a partner company and they're going to have a different schema, you could go and you could create a completely different forest. And then you could start sharing resources between these two different forests. Now, would a trust relationship like that happen automatically? As you might guess, no way. Sometimes trust relationships happen automatically, like we're going to create the east.nuggetlab.com, and it's going to have an automatic two-way transitive trust with its parent. But certain trusts, like this one, we would have to manually create. Trusting is such a big issue, I'll have a nugget on that in and of itself. But I just wanted to review with you here how complex a domain and forest structure can become, and we also need to practice this parent-child domain creation inside a hands-on lab. In your hands-on lab, no surprise, we've got DCNug1 and we've got DCNug2. I want you to start by getting logged in to DCNug1. Once you've done that, slide over to DCNug2 and let's get logged in. Notice DCNug2 is not participating in any domain. Now, just so you didn't kill me, I went ahead and pre-installed Active Directory domain services for you. So that step is done. Let's launch our Server Manager and prove that. When we get into Server Manager, we're going to see that Active Directory domain services is there. And we're going to get a notification here because we need to finish up Active Directory. Specifically, we need to promote this server to a domain controller. So let's click on that link, and it brings us to this screen. I wanted to refresh you on this screen. Isn't this critical when we're building a complex enterprise structure? We can add a domain controller to an existing domain. We've certainly practiced this step in earlier nuggets. We can add a new domain to an existing forest, or we could create the new forest here. What we're going to do is add a new domain to an existing forest, and notice our options. We can create a separate tree in this forest, or we can do a child domain off an existing tree. The parent domain name we know is Nugget Lab, and the new domain name that we're going to give it is, let's do that, east.nuggetlab.com. We want to provide credentials that would get this work done. It would be credentials in Nugget Lab. We'll use a backslash, and we'll drop in the administrator name off the clipboard, and then off the clipboard, we'll drop in the password. We'll say OK. This is certainly a domain administrator that would have the ability to create this child domain. We choose next, and this step is going to take some time as it is checking the credentials of this account that we have provided and ensuring that we can create this child domain off of the Nugget Lab parent. Once that completes, we can set our domain functional level. We'll talk about this much more in an upcoming nugget. And then we'll decide what parameters we want. For instance, is this going to be a DNS server? Is it going to be a global catalog server? Next up, we're going to say, yes, we want to put this in the default first site name. That's great. And then we'll set our directory services restore mode password. I'll just go ahead and drop that in off of the clipboard, of course, and we'll choose next. It says, okay, do we want to do DNS delegation? Do we want DNS to participate with the parent domain, and do we want that delegation? For more information on DNS and delegation and everything involving DNS, really, I would point you to Keith Barker's incredible 70-741 course here, where he specifies just on the networking aspects of Windows Server 2016. We're going to do DNS delegation and choose next. It will then come up with the NetBIOS domain name for this new child domain that we're creating. And it's, of course, going to choose the word East. That's fine with us, especially since we're not even using NetBIOS with old down-level clients. And we'll choose next. And I think that should pretty much wrap it up. It's, of course, going to do its checks. And before it does those checks, it's going to make sure of the database locations. That's great. We're going to stick with the defaults. And now it shows us our selections that we have in place. We could view the script from a PowerShell perspective that made this possible, and we're ready to choose next, run through the checks for prerequisites, and then finally choose install. Let's go ahead and do this installation. I'll pause the video. We know this system is going to reboot, and when it reboots, we'll come back in and we'll do some experimentation with this new parent-to-child relationship. Well, excellent. You can see we have rebooted on this DC NUG 2 following that installation, and we are about to log into the east.nuggetlab.com domain. Let's log in there, and let's create a user account, and then ensure that we can take this user account and place it in, how about a domain local group of the parent? This would be something that would follow the Microsoft model. Let's jump into Server Manager and go to Users and Computers, and we'll create in the east.nuggetlab.com domain one of our favorite user accounts of all time. So let's get in here to the users container. Notice where we're looking at, east.nuggetlab.com. We'll right click, we will choose new, we will choose user, and this is our test J user with its login name of T user. We'll say next. We will drop in a password off the clipboard and confirm it. And finally, we'll choose finish. So there's our user account. Let's slide up to DC NUG 1, which is in the parent domain of Nugget Lab, and let's drop in the password. And we're going to head over to the Active Directory Users and Computers tool. We'll get there via Server Manager. And inside here, we're going to create a new domain local group. So let's just right click, choose new, choose group. We'll call this group important people, and we'll make sure it's a domain local security group. Say OK. And now we're ready to populate it with a member. But notice when we choose add, we're going to be looking at the nuggetlab.com domain. We need to look at our child domain. So we're clicking this locations button to choose the location. Here is the correct location, east.nuggetlab.com. We're going to say OK, and we'll do a search on test and see if we can find that testj user account from east.nuggetlab.com. We can. We say OK. We say OK again, and now we have a domain local security group with a member from the child domain east.nuggetlab.com. So just a look here at the creation of those additional domains within a forest and how we can set up the resources between those domains. In this nugget, we reviewed just how complex a domain infrastructure can become within a forest, and we know we could even create additional forests and then manually create trust relationships between them. We'll be examining trust relationships in more detail as I promised. In the hands-on lab here, we created a child domain of an existing parent domain to see just how simple that would be to do. I hope you found this nugget informative, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.